Safety first now with our good friend Brian Germain.
Hey, Brian, how you doing today?
Hey, Dave. I'm doing great.
Today's safety first is one that's been on my mind many times. I'm interested to get your take on it. A lot of us jump smaller, higher loaded main canopies.
Me too.
I have one that's it's about 2.3, 2.4 on the wing loading. I don't want a reserve loaded like that.
Nope, me neither.
But I also hear this talk about how if mains and reserves are too far apart in size, then the chance of a main reserve entanglement in a two canopy out situation becomes much greater.
You bet it is, yeah.
So this is kind of a big issue, and I'm going to let you tackle it.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Punt to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not an impossible scenario. I mean, obviously, you don't want to load an F-111 7-cell parachute at 2.4. The possibility of having an unconscious deployment or something like that, where you're landing off the drop zone in weird situations, you want to have a little bit of fabric. At the same time, yes, if you are towing two parachutes at the same time, you want them to cooperate. Now, we have on one hand the surface area of the parachutes, and you say, okay, from that perspective, you know, for me, my 91 is not going to fly terribly well with my 126 if you only look at it from the perspective of fabric, from surface area. But it turns out that many of the studies are pointing to the fact that line length matters just as much, if not more. And fortunately for us, most of the high-performance mains have much longer lines proportionally than the reserves do. Right? You ever notice when you pack a reserve that the lines are not that long? It gives you better openings, and it just 7 cells can handle shorter lines in general because of the lower aspect ratio. So we have them cooperating, even though you've got some disparity in terms of the square footage. They tend to cooperate fairly well. That's assuming that you leave the toggles alone. Right? So if you unstow the toggles on your high-performance parachute when you've got your reserve inflated also, let's say in a side-by-side or in a stack, you're begging the Reaper to take you down. So you really need to leave those toggles stowed in that kind of thing. And if you can get rid of that main, you might have to release your RSL before you do so, but you might be able to cut away, assuming that they're not in some sort of funny, tangled configuration. Side-by-sides are usually a pretty predictable cutaway, that it's most likely to work. If the main is in the front, maybe not. If you've got a stack, it may not be a good choice to chop, because the risers, as you cut away, can swing back into the reserve and maybe entangle. That certainly is a little bit of a risk. But yeah, I think that it makes sense to have a reserve that's a little bigger.
Do you think, I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and my final way of deciding it for me is I feel that I'm more likely to be under my reserve in a situation where either I'm hurt or incapacitated in some way, or where I'm going to have to end up making an off-field landing into a small area because I got open low or something. I personally believe that scenario is more likely to happen than two canopies out.
Totally.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, provided that you break off high and pull high on a regular basis, you're not that likely to have your Cypress or your Argus or whatever fire. And if you check your pin on a regular basis, and you can check the condition of your reserve closing loop on a regular basis, the odds of a two-out situation are pretty small. It doesn't tend to happen all that often. But I totally agree with that risk assessment, that if you go with the probabilities, what's likely to happen, it makes sense to have a little more square footage over your head when you're in an emergency situation.
And do you think there's some place or at some point where it's just way too much? Like if I'm jumping a 99 main and I have a 220 reserve, I mean, at some point you run into container issues as well, correct? Where it's just not going to match up correctly for the container?
Sure. Well, you could make it match, if you fill your main parachute with packing peanuts, or you put, pack some sort of something to take up the volume in your main pack tray. You could actually put yourself in a situation where you have the reserve that's gigantic and the main that's not. And sure, yeah, that's risky. Absolutely. There's lots of dumb things that you can do in this sport.
And then now we're also seeing some of the manufacturers coming out with low bulk reserves now as well.
I applaud that.
Which should make that that fit work better, correct?
I think that's really helping us in that regard, that you can have a reasonable size reserve now and still have a relatively small container. And from what I can tell, looking at PD's Optimum, that's a fantastic parachute.
I believe the TSOs just recently came out for the larger sizes too, where they're starting to deliver some of the larger ones now.
It's a great idea, and apparently it's a very good product too.
Brian, thanks so much. Always love having you on. Can't wait to talk to you next week. And between now and then, our listeners can go to bigairsports.com
with
a Z.
That's
sportswithaz.com. Brian, thanks so much. We'll talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
Come down on you too, and leave your body alone. Somebody wants to keep